What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the fighting game tutorial series, we're going to be going over stores part 2. So in the previous episode on our store or our shop, we had our elements within a data table being displayed to our store widget. But all we could do was display an initial group of the elements on the right hand side here. So I'm going to hover with my mouse so you can see that we have the mannequin and the mutant here. And we were pulling that again from the data table, but we were only able to pull it once on begin play. In today's episode, we're going to be adding navigation, so you can see that my characters button here has some of the highlight around it to say that we've selected it, just like our other buttons in our game. So now I can navigate through my different options, and then when I select one, it will reload the category. So I'm on characters, so pressing it doesn't do anything. But if I go down to stages and select it, now it shows all the possible stages. The same thing happens for outfits and skins and game settings. I don't have any items in the data table for them. I have not changed the data table since last time, but if we go ahead and open that up real quick, I will show you everything that we do have just to remind you. So I have this unlockable item data table. I have 2 characters, the mannequin and the mutant, and then I have 4 stages, which are the 4 stages we actually have in the game. Again, I haven't added anything for the other categories, so technically nothing showing up is actually working as intended. The store only grabs data from the data table, and it will show us exactly what is in the store, what is in the shop for us to buy. It's not going to arbitrarily fill up with information. So if there's nothing there, there's nothing there, plain and simple. So that's what we're going to be covering today, being able to navigate our menu and then select these different categories to display different elements on the screen. We will not be able to select individual items just yet, but that will be happening in the next episode. We will be able to navigate to the right and to the left and actually go and select the individual items, in which case we'll then go over buying them and unlocking them, that sort of thing. I would like to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support. I'm so excited about this shop implementation, and I know some of you were asking about this, so I hope you enjoy it as well. Before we get started on this episode, if you'd like to get caught up in the series, I can link you to the entire playlist so you can see everything we've done in the fighting game tutorial series up until this point. It's right here in the top right corner. Otherwise, if you don't care about the rest of the tutorial and you only care about the shop, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to watch the rest of the tutorial series to get that working. I'll go ahead and link you to the first episode of the shop right here, so you can check out what we did to get to this point of the store widget. We don't have to touch the code today at all, so I'm just going to go to my blueprints, my widgets, and specifically my store widget. We're going to be doing everything in here today because we're going to be going over navigating, displaying the current choice to the user, and then actually being able to select this option and update our data within our store widget here. There's one quick thing that we need to do in the designer view. That way we can make sure we can get it in the graph. We need to make sure that our category VB, or basically our category vertical box, is a variable. It was not a variable in the previous episode, so make sure you do make it one, because we're going to use this vertical box to determine how many elements we can move up and down, and thus we're going to need to have that data in the graph. You could hard code it, but this way is a little bit better in case you want to add additional categories in the future, or take them away. Once you've done that, you can go into your graph. And inside the graph, we'll start in the event graph. We are going to need to do our basic menu navigation logic, and I've shown a bunch of different methods even within just the fighting game tutorial series, so feel free to use your own method if you'd like. In the event graph, we previously were getting the rows of our data table, looping through them, and displaying all of the elements as long as the type was character. Now, that's pretty simple, and actually it can stay because at this point we do start on the character category. So to show something in the store widget, you can start on characters. So if you want to leave it like I have, that's perfectly fine. But what I've done is added all this logic before it. These events, you may have seen them before. These are listen for input actions. So what this does is it allows us to take in an action name and listen for it, meaning that when the player presses this specific action mapping, we then perform an action on this widget. So it's actually pretty simple. If we search for listen for input action, we can leave the target as self because that's the one that is listening for the action. The action name has to match what you have in your project settings. So if you go to Edit, Project Settings, scroll down to Engine, Input, then look at your action mappings. I have a bunch of controls in here. I do have some menu specific ones just so that it is very obvious which ones I'm using, but you could also just use your standard right, left, up, down, whatever it is that you want to use. In today's episode, all we really need is up, down, confirm, and potentially a back if you want to be able to back out of this menu. So I have menu up P1, which is W on my keyboard, menu down P1, which is S on my keyboard, and then menu confirm P1, which is the 1 key on my keyboard. They also have corresponding gamepad options. So for menu confirm, I can press the gamepad face button bottom or like A on an Xbox controller. For menu down P1, press down on the thumbstick, on the left thumbstick specifically. Or for menu up P1, press up on the left thumbstick. Now, in this episode, I did actually cover menu left P1 and menu right P1. I've added them in here, and I've set up the logic so that it will work, but it won't work right now because we're not going to implement the rest of it, but I am going to add the listens in here just so that we don't have to do that next time. If you want to wait, by all means, you can just add this in when we do the next episode. Menu left P1, I have A on my keyboard or left thumbstick left, and menu right P1, I have D on my keyboard or left thumbstick right. Lastly, you might want to see my return P1, which is backspace on my keyboard or face button right on a gamepad, so like the B button on an Xbox controller. And this is how we can return out of the store menu. Once you have all of these action mappings set up and all the action mappings that you'll need for your buttons on this widget in this menu, you can either copy them directly from here or just take note of what they are, and we're going to listen for each of them. So I have a listen for input action with menu left P1, a listen for input action with menu right P1, a listen for input action with menu up P1, menu down P1, menu confirm P1, return P1. The event type on any of these or all of them can be pressed because as soon as we press it, we want to do it. You could, of course, change this if you want to. Consume is if we want to consume the input, meaning once this runs, nothing else gets that data, like no other menus know that we pressed that button. We don't need it here, so I'm not going to check it. And off of each listen for input action, once this input action has been found to be pressed, we can call an event. This callback will be blank when you get this note in here. If you drag off the callback and type add custom event, click this, it'll make a new event, and then you can name it whatever you want. From here, I called it P1 menu left, for example. Basically, whatever the action is that I'm doing. So menu left P1 input action calls P1 menu left. Menu right P1 input action calls P1 menu right. Menu up P1 calls P1 menu up. Menu down P1 calls P1 menu down. Menu confirm P1 calls P1 menu confirm. And return P1 calls P1 back. Now once we have all this done, we are ready to implement all the new functions we're going to need today. That way we can start calling them. So we had no functions prior, so you can see I have 5 functions now. So we're going to update all of these functions to have the proper logic so that it looks like we're navigating through the menu. To start off, let's go ahead and make each function. So I just pressed plus function to add one. We'll start with move selection. So I made a function called move selection. When you make it, you'll come in here, but you'll have nothing. You'll just have the purple node. What I did is I added 3 input parameters. I added a direction, which is like up, down. It can also be left and right. Again, we're not really going over that today, but I am going to set up that logic so that we don't have to worry about it in the future, because this is a pretty complicated one, but it's easier just to knock it all out in one go. Direction is an integer, so once you add a new input parameter, call it direction, and set the type to be integer, you'll be good to go. I've also added 2 booleans, so you can add 2 more parameters, both boolean, and I called them is horizontal movement and play sound effects. So let me explain these. Is horizontal movement determines if the player entered a movement on this widget that is horizontal. This is important because when we look at our store widget here, I have 4 options to go between: characters, stages, outfits, skins, and game settings when I'm going up or down. So when I'm using vertical movement. But when I want to go, say, to the right or to the left, I can only go from characters to mannequin to mutant right now, and then back to mannequin and characters. That's only 3 selections. So the number of times I can move around and where we're actually positioned on the store widget depends on the type of vertical or horizontal movement that we're doing. So we're going to go ahead and make sure that we know if it's vertical or horizontal, which is very easy because we already are listening for the actions. So that won't be a problem, but make sure you add that boolean. And then the play sound effects boolean is just if we should play the sound effects when we're moving between these options. We have a nice little sound when we go up and down the categories that plays, and if we don't want to play it, then we can just ignore that. Now, in the move selection function, really all we have to do is determine if the input that the user pressed was valid, and we can determine that based on where we're currently at and how many elements there are in the direction we're trying to move. So it looks pretty complicated in here, but actually it's not too bad. So we're going to need a current row, a current selection in row, and max selections in each row variable. So let's add these now. So make 2 variables that are integers, current row and current selection in row. Current row is going to keep track of what category we are on: characters, stages, outfits, skins, and game settings. It also can be used to keep track of which one we're on in the store, assuming that we have, let's say, 4 items that line this top row, and then we go to another row below it. We could use it for that as well, but again, we're not going into that today. Current selection row is essentially the current column that we are on within that row. So again, using the mutant and mannequin example, there were 2 characters. So if I'm on the mannequin on the left, that would be index 0. But if I go to the mutant, that would be index 1. And max selections in each row is how many items there are that we can move between in each row. So once again, max selections in each row. If we are on the characters button, characters itself is a selection, the mannequin is a selection, and the mutant is a selection. So there are 3 selections within the row. Right now, since we aren't going over movement within this box on the right, we only have 1 selection in each row. However, we want to make sure that we have the correct number of rows in here. You can either set this by actually assigning it in construct, or you can hard code it. Either way works. So again, that's current row, which is an integer that has a default value of 0, current selection in row, which is an integer that has a default value of 0, and then max selections in each row is an integer array. So typically, the integer will be this little pill type, which is the single variable. If you click on it, you can get more object types, and you can change it to an array. Then if you go down to default value, you can press the plus adds element to add elements in this array. And I'm just going to default it to 4 because we have 4 categories right now. I'm going to make each of the elements in this array just 1 because we only have a length of 1. We're not going to allow the user any movement over here as of this episode, so everything's 1. This will need to be dynamic later so that we can actually move to the appropriate elements based on the category selection. But again, for now, 1 is fine. With all those variables made, we are ready to actually create this function. So move selection right off the bat, we want to check if horizontal movement is true or false, because this changes how we test to see if the movement was valid within this widget. So we drag off is horizontal movement and put it directly into a branch. We know that if the branch is true, we have moved in the horizontal direction. So the logic for this goes as follows. If our current selection in the row plus the direction we're trying to move, left will be -1, right will be 1, is greater than the minimum and less than the maximum, we can actually move there. Otherwise, we don't want to take the movement. Let's say our current selection in row is 3. And let's say that we have 5 elements in this row. If the player is trying to move to the right. That is a movement of 1. So 3 plus 1 equals 4. Remember that the maximum is 5. Max equals 5. We have a location that we want to move to, which is index 4 here. Now, 4 has to be greater than the minimum, which is -1. Because we do have an index of 0. We start at 0. So it's got to be greater than the minimum, which means it is 0 or above. And it has to be less than the maximum. The max is 5. Well, 4 is, in fact, less than 5. So both of these check out, meaning that we can actually move to that spot. Now, if we undo all of this, get rid of all of this, and let's say we are at index 0 right now, and we want to move to the left. That's a 0 minus 1, which is -1. So we have -1 is greater than the minimum, which is -1, and -1 is less than the maximum, which is 5. Well, we know that this is not true because -1 is equal to -1, not greater than it. But -1 is less than the maximum. That still doesn't mean that we can actually move there. And thus, we can't move to this spot, so we're just not going to do anything. That's what this branch is really determining. If the branch returns false, then we don't do anything. If it's true, we update our current selection in the row. So now writing that in here, we take our current selection in row, put it into an int plus int node. So basically, current selection in row, integer plus integer. And we pass in the direction that the player is trying to move. Then we check to see if it is greater than the minimum. So this one's simple. We just drag off the plus, take integer greater than integer, and manually put in -1 because we know that it has to be greater than -1. We bring this result into an AND bool node. And then we have to make sure that the new spot we want to move to is less than the maximum. So to do that, we use our max selections in each row and get it at the current row we were on. Right? Max selections in each row works like this. We have 4 rows. So if we use our current row, say we are on stages, this is going to be an index of 1. So passing in current row at an index of 1 is going to return the element here. So max selections in each row get at current row. Then we want to make sure that the result of the addition is less than integer, the result from the get right here. Then pass that into the AND as well. If this is true, we know we have found a correct horizontal movement. This is a possible horizontal movement. So we want to bring this AND into a branch, and then only if it's true do we want to set the current selection in row to the result of the addition. Now, if is horizontal movement returns false, we know this is vertical movement. So the same rules apply. We just have to change how we're checking things to make sure that we're still within a valid range. So we take our current row and add the direction to it. Remember, it's the same rules. So if we have 4 rows, 0, 1, 2, and 3, for 4 rows, and we add 1, we're going down. If we subtract 1, we're going up. We take our current row, we add our direction, and we want to make sure that the result is greater than our minimum, which is -1, and the result should be less than the maximum rows that we have. Our max selections in each row will have as many elements in it as there are rows, because each row has a max selections. So row 0 has 1 selection, row 1 has 1 selection, row 2 has 1 selection, row 3 has 1 selection. Index 0, 1, 2, 3. Index 0, 1, 2, 3. So the length of this array will be how many rows there are. That's our maximum. So current row plus direction has to be less than max selections in each row length, but greater than -1. If both of those return true, we bring it into the branch, and then we can continue on. If they return false, we don't do anything. We can't accept that movement. If it is true, we take the results of the current row in the addition and set our current row to be that new value. I also go ahead and set current selection row back to 0. This way we can start at the leftmost element in that row. This does all the logic we need for proper movement, whether it be vertical or horizontal, in our store widget. Both paths are going to meet up, and we're going to call a new function that we make now, which is called determine button to focus. So make a new function if you haven't already, and call it determine button to focus. This one's pretty simple. Basically, we have to determine what button we are on based on the row we're on. Remember, for now, we're just able to select the category buttons. So we only have 4 buttons, and they're all within the category vertical box. That's why this has to be a variable. Inside of a determine button to focus, we can grab our category vertical box. You can do it by dragging it here and getting it, or actually searching get category vertical box. Now the vertical box is a container element, so you can get all children to determine everything that is within this vertical box. And you can see on the hierarchy that the category vertical box has the characters button, the stages button, the outfits and skins button, and the game settings button. They also have children, but we're only worried about the top row for right now, each individual button. Then we can drag off the get all children and get a copy at the current row. So whatever row we are on, that is the index we want to grab. We want to cast it to make sure it's a button. We only care about the buttons anyway. Then we want to add a return node because we want this determine button to focus to return a button so that we know this is the button that we have selected. This is the one that we want to highlight. This is the one that we want to show the data for. So if I select stages, I want to highlight this button. But also, when we confirm it, I'm going to want to display the elements related to stages in this box over here. So on the determine button to focus function, we're going to add an output parameter by pressing the plus new parameter here. And I want the object type to be button. And it'll be an object reference. Then I've called it button reference. If the cast of the button succeeds, we want to use a return node. You may have one already here by default when you add the output parameter, but otherwise you can just type add return node and you'll get one here. If the cast succeeds, we want to pass in the cast result to the button reference, but if the cast fails, we don't want to have anything. We want the reference to be null or empty. And that's determine button to focus. Now go back into move selection and make sure that you call this function and that both paths ultimately end up going into that node. Now, knowing what button to focus is great, and we can use it for several things. Immediately after this, we're going to use it to show the hovered option. So we want to make another function on top of this, so add a new function, and I've called it display hovered option. Display hovered option is going to take in that button reference that the determine button to focus output. Okay, so see how they pass it directly from one another? So display hovered option is going to have an input parameter of type button object reference, and I'm calling it button reference. First thing we want to do is make sure that the button is valid. It's not really required that you do this because it should be valid at this point since it's found. However, if you are being really intricate with how you're changing your objects that are on the screen, when we get to the next section where we're actually being able to go over our specific store items, buttons may be deleted, in which case we don't want to try and move to a button that is invalid and do stuff with it. That'll cause a crash or at the very least some errors. So it's a good check to do here, even though we don't really need it for today's episode. So drag off the button reference and just check is valid. And you want the question mark one. Either will work, but this one's just easier for the current scenario. Only if it's valid do we go into the next logic. Now we want to go through our category vertical box and get all children again, but this time instead of picking a specific one, we're going to loop through them all. And we're going to see if we find a match. So basically, are we on one of the buttons in this vertical box? And if we are, what should we do with that information? So in this for each loop, we want to take the element that comes from it and cast it to a button. Again, just like in the previous function, we only care about the buttons that are children of the category vertical box. We don't care about the text and all that specific stuff. So off the array element, cast the button, just like we did before. And assuming it is a button, we'll go into this branch. Now, this is what's super important about this function here. We only want to display the correct option as hovered or selected if it's the one that the player is actually navigating over top of. Otherwise, it would be really confusing for the player where they are at on the menu. To do this, we can drag off of our button cast and make sure that it is not equal object to the button reference that was passed in this function. That's this node here. If they are not equal, if it's true that they're not equal, we're going to reset the button style back to the default value. Essentially, we're going to set the button style to be empty, not selected. We can drag off of our cast the button. I have a reroute node that comes down here and goes into here. But essentially drag off your button and type set style. And we want the one that says variables appearance set style. You'll get this set widget style, and you can right click on the pin and split that to open up some more options. For me, I don't really use a lot of these because I am doing it all through our manual navigation system. But the widget style normal is how it looks at all times if you're not hovering it, if you're not pressing it, and things like that. So I want to split the struct pin on the widget style normal, and you'll get the node that I have here on the left. From here, I want to make sure that the widget style normal image is the default image, not the hovered and selected image, but the regular image of a button when it is not being interacted with or hovered over top of. I happen to want to draw mine as a box instead of an image because I prefer the proportions and the appearance when it's a box, but that's not required. That is up to you. And so essentially, all the buttons that we're not hovering over top of, they're going to be reset to the default image. However, if the cast of the button not equal to the button reference is false, that means they are the same button, or they are equal, in which case we want to set that button to be the selected or highlighted button. And you can see here, that is the button with the blue outline. I know it's tough to see, but that's really what this is. It's the blue outline button. This right here. So if it's false, I do the exact same thing, but I just change the image that's being used. So instead of the default button variation, which is this one, that is all gray with a black outline, we're using the selected, which is the one with the blue outline. Great. Now once we've done this, go back to move selection and make sure that determine button to focus is followed by display hovered option, and it's passing button reference into the button reference. The last thing we need to do in move selection is use our play sound effects boolean. I have a reroute node that goes down here, which goes into another branch. If it's true that we should play the sound effect, at this point we have actually moved our element. So I'm just using play sound 2D, and I have an arbitrary sound here that I have called back out, but I happen to use it for my movement because I think it sounds nice. So I'm playing that sound. If it's false, just don't play it. That is move selection, determine button to focus, and display hovered options finished. Now we still need to cover confirm selection and change category, but let's go back into the event graph and let's set up our movement function calls on our listen for input actions. So if you have all these events set up, it's pretty easy to fill out move selection because it's self-explanatory after you do the first one. So let's call move selection for P1 menu left, and it's going to look like this initially. We have to manually put in the direction. We know that the player is trying to move to the left, and that is a direction of -1. Since it's left, it is horizontal movement, so we can check that box. It's horizontal movement, and since it is an input pressed by the player causing this movement, I want to play the sound effects. And that's how you get this node here. Now, for P1 menu right, I've done the same thing, but the direction is +1, not -1, because we're moving to the right. Now, up and down are a little bit different. So the direction of up is -1, we're moving up. That's a negative value, but it's not horizontal movement, so that is unchecked. I still want to play the sound effects though. If it's down, the direction is +1, no horizontal movement, but still play the sound effects. Now the other ones we need are confirm and back. Back I actually haven't set up yet because we're going to set that up in the next episode, but confirm we're going to go over. So make a new function and call it confirm selection. Once you do that, we can set it up. This doesn't have any input or output parameters, but we are going to call our determine button to focus function, which will return the button reference that we are actually selecting right now, so we know what specific logic to do. So call determine button to focus, and then you can do this many different ways. A way I like to do it, although it's a little messy, I think this is the easiest because it makes a lot of sense what's going on. We take our determine button to focus, and this returns the button that the player is currently hovering over or selecting. From here, we just want to check this button reference against each of our buttons. So button reference equal object, and then we pass in the buttons that the player could select, such as the characters button. We bring this into a branch, and if it's true that it was the characters button, that means the player pressed the confirm button while hovering the characters button, so they want to switch the category to be the characters. If it's false that it was the characters button, we check it against the stages button, and if that's true, we want to change our category to be the stages. If that's false, we check against the outfits and skins button, and if that's true, we want to change the category to be our outfits and skins. Lastly, if that's false, we check against our game settings button, and if that's true, we want to call change category and set it to the game settings. Now additionally, if we had a back button in here, we simply check and see if it's equal to the back button, and if it is, we go ahead and return from this page, or from this store. You could also just use an array, loop through the category vertical box, and check against each individual element. Last thing we need in here is our change category function, which we haven't set up yet. So go ahead and make one final function, and we'll call it change category. In this, I do have an input parameter, so add a new one that is an integer that is called category index. Change category, remember I'm calling these categories, is going to update the actual logic that we see on the store widget based on the button that we selected. We go inside our change category option here. This is what our function will look like. We want to clear all the children that we already have in this horizontal box because we don't want them just adding on top of each other. If we don't do this, it'll look like this, where we are just expanding upon the options that we already have in our store. And that's not what we want. We want to only show the elements that relate to this specific type. So we want to take our horizontal box, which if you remember in the event graph, the horizontal box is the one that has the children added to it. So the horizontal box is really the widget that is holding the images that we have for the store items. We can use item, horizontal box, and call clear children, which is a function that exists for panel widgets. It's that simple. This will remove all children in a horizontal box safely. So then we can use our category index here to plug it into a switch statement and then retrieve the appropriate data. For the switch, we just use switch on int. You can get it, and then pass in the input parameter, the category index, from the function. Then you can select add pin for as many elements as you want. So I can have 4 elements and then the default element. So if you go into your event graph and look at that logic I mentioned at the start, which is the logic we previously had in this widget, you can copy this. Copy this entire thing, because we're going to basically use exactly this 4 times over. Go back into your change category and paste it. You can paste it 4 times if you want. You can see that this is exactly the same logic as we already had. Nothing has changed. Quick refresher, we go through all the data table rows, grab each individual element, check the type to see if it's character, and then if it is, we create a store item icon widget, set the details such as the name of the character, and then add the child to the horizontal box so we can see it. Well, this is only true if our category index is 0, because characters is index 0, stages is index 1, outfits and skins is index 2, game settings is index 3. So each one of these is going to be exactly the same, except for one minor change, which is just going to be this comparison on the type. So for characters, we check to see if the type is equal to character. But on the index 1 element, we're going to check to see if the type is equal to stage. On index 2, we're going to check to see if the type is equal to outfit. And on index 3, we're going to check to see if the type is equal to game settings. Additionally, as a default, in case this switch statement receives a value that doesn't fit between 0 and 3, it will take this one. I'm just putting at the start, which is the characters selection. At this point, our change category is also working and functioning as intended. You can still leave the logic that we copied in the event graph because this is just when the widget loads. So you can feel free to keep that. That way it still loads the characters by default. But now we will be able to change the categories. So go back into confirm selection and now call your new function, change category, on each of these branches. And make sure you pass in the proper index. So again, characters button will be index 0. Stages button is index 1. Outfits and skins button is index 2. And game settings button is index 3. One more time, let's go back to the event graph, and now let's finish our P1 menu confirm event by calling our confirm selection function right here. Again, this function doesn't take anything in, so you just literally call it, and it's that simple. The back we won't get into today, but I will explain it in full next time. After that, I actually manually call move selection here because I want to do the logic to determine what option is highlighted when the player comes in. But I don't want to actually move it from where it starts. So I pass in a direction of 0. Doesn't matter if it's horizontal movement or not. It will work either way. And then we don't want to play sound effects this time because the player did not trigger this movement. This is just something we're doing behind the scenes to get it looking correct without any user input. You will have a store widget where you can go between the different categories and make the selection that you want to display the proper items from your data table. Anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters again. Thank you for all the love and support and for making this series possible. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to help you, and it is completely free. And like I said, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.